Gardening has a way of opening my heart. I don't know if it's the fresh air, digging in the soil, or just realizing how much of my spiritual life is reflected in the gardening process. But whichever it is, gardening makes me more introspective. It's like the beauty and life that God put into nature seeps into my heart and softens it a little bit. This has not always been true for me. Gardening used to feel like a chore. But as I have learned to love gardening and realize how rich the symbolism is between gardening and how we seek and follow Jesus, it just keeps drawing me deeper into this working metaphor of growth in our hearts. A soft heart is always better for growing, just like soft soil is better for growing. We just need to be intentional enough to notice the similarities between the garden and our hearts. They may not be obvious at first, so we need to do a little digging. Weeds can be kind of annoying. Whether you have a garden or just cracks in your sidewalk, weeds show their faces anywhere they find open soil and are usually not very welcome, at least not in my garden. What emotions does seeing weeds in your space elicit for you? Annoyance, irritation, discouragement, apathy? Some people don't even notice the weeds because the weeds are part of their daily environment. Instead of allowing yourself to get overwhelmed or annoyed by the weeds, make a choice on how you're going to use this internal time you have, the time of your thoughts. Can you turn the moment of noticing the weed, or even better, while you're in the middle of weeding, turn that into a moment of spiritual growth in your heart? There is deep symbolism in weeds. So, what's the symbolism? Well, sins resemble weeds in a surprisingly large number of ways. Doesn't sin creep into our hearts like tiny little weed seeds and then germinate and grow into something much bigger? Don't those sins, when allowed to root into the soil of our hearts untended, start to crowd and choke out the desired plants we worked hard to plant and nurture? Do we sometimes not even notice the sins are there because we've just become used to them as part of the environment of our hearts? Don't sins thrive in heart environments that are untended and don't have protection against their little seeds? A weed in our garden and a sin in our hearts should create, at the very least, the same level of annoyance. They are on complete opposite ends as far as their eternal significance. But don't we sometimes get more annoyed by little weeds that are creating just untidiness in our gardens than we do about sins that are creating havoc in our hearts? Maybe you've become accustomed to your weeds and you don't even notice them anymore. They're just part of your landscape. Do you notice the sin? Or do you just ignore it as it hardens your heart to God, to the world, to the people you love? And I say all of this from a place of being very familiar with doing that exact thing. If that is you, you are not alone in that. It's easy to not care about one little sin seed, and yet the level of destruction caused by one ignored sin is so much higher than the level of destruction caused by one ignored weed in a garden. Shouldn't we care more about the sin? Taking care of our hearts needs to start with a clearing out of the land. We need to get the weeds out of there. But first, we have to know what our weeds are. I've heard it said that there's no such thing as a weed, but that a weed is just an undesirable plant that shows up where you don't want it. In other words, what is a weed for me may not be a weed for you. For example, I have a bunch of pokeberry that has seeded itself in the back corner of our yard by our shed. I don't want it there, but I haven't been diligent enough to get rid of it throughout the summer. So now I have a large colony of pokeberry plants surrounding our shed and making it look like a little woodland forest under our pine trees. And I know that sounds kind of nice, and some people may like that woodland look in their gardens and want to keep the plants as food for wildlife. That's important for me too, but I'd rather do that with other, less obnoxious plants. For me, as cute as those little arching stems and hanging berries are, it reseeds readily, and I don't want that area to become overgrown and create more work and more problems for me next year. So I've determined that in my yard and garden, pokeberry is a weed. My tendency sins may not be your tendency sins. We need to identify where our weak spots are, which, by the way, are not ignored by the enemy. We need to know what they are to be able to protect against the seeds he tries to plant. And then we have to dig those sins out. We can go through with a weed whacker for the quick and easy solution, just so we don't have to look at them anymore. Sometimes we try and pull them out by the roots, but we don't use the right tools to get down deep enough, and the weeds break off at the surface. Isn't that so frustrating when that happens? In either case, if we aren't removing the weed by its root, it is still established in the soil. It has a whole root system that we can't see, and it's only a matter of days before that weed grows back. We can't ignore the roots of our sin that have a well-established root system in our hearts. If we cut our sin off at the soil level, just getting rid of the selfishness or anger or pride that others can see in our lives, but don't pull out the root in our hearts, it will only be a matter of days before that sin becomes evident again in our lives. The natural tendency of soil is to fill itself full. It wants to grow things. That's how God designed it. But it's not very discriminate about what it fills itself with. Just whatever seed falls and takes root. This is the natural tendency of our hearts too. God created our hearts to want to be full. But He created them to want to be full of Him. If we are not discriminate about what we allow to fill our hearts will fill themselves with whatever falls and takes root. What tends to take root in your heart when you're not being intentional? I know for me, it's usually sin. Our heart's default mode is sin. Can you feel this? It takes effort and intention to grow. When we stop putting effort and intention into our lives, our growth stagnates and our hearts start hardening. Sometimes it happens slowly, but we become apathetic and complacent. That is where selfishness, entitlement, and an unhealthy focus on our circumstances flourish. We are blinded and distracted by the things going on around us in our world. And they just start as tiny little seeds somewhere in the soil of our hearts, putting down roots so slowly we hardly even notice, unless we're looking for them. It takes extra effort to turn our eyes and hearts to God when our hearts and the world around us are telling us to focus on ourselves. To maintain growth, we have to be intentional with tending our hearts and the direction our hearts are turned. Tending our hearts on a regular basis is one of the most important things we can do to keep spiritual weeds out of our hearts. When we don't tend our gardens, the weeds have more time to establish big, strong roots. And if the garden is left uncared for or untended for long enough, the weeds go to seed and send out all their little clones, either to drop on the nearby soil, be carried in the wind, or be eaten and deposited out by birds. But when we spend regular time walking through our garden, looking for those small weed seeds that may have germinated overnight, and pull them out when they're tiny, they never establish roots that are hard to pull out. When we neglect our hearts and don't tend to them, sin weeds grow fast and strong. Have you noticed that if there's a sin that you allow to grow freely, it creates almost a fortress or a stronghold in your heart? Its foundation goes down deep, and the walls that you build up around you on top of that foundation can shoot up pretty quick and are hard to tear down. Regularly tending to our hearts and pulling out the sins when they are just thoughts and feelings saves us so much work and heartache and strained relationships. We need to take our thoughts captive, meaning we have to notice them first. We can't capture something that managed to slip by us when we weren't paying attention. We have to see it, recognize it as a danger, and then make it obedient to Christ. For something to be obedient means that it submits to or follows orders from an authority. Christ is the authority we want our thoughts to be submitting to. We want our minds and hearts to be more similar to Christ than to ourselves or the world, right? So we notice and capture every sinful thought, each sin seed, and we hold it up to the standard of Christ. The standard of Christ is also the standard of the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit's role is to remind us of everything Jesus taught us. Jesus tells us that in John 14:26. So are we producing fruit that is in line with the Holy Spirit? The fruit we produce will be determined by what is in our hearts. Jesus told us, out of the heart, the mouth speaks. The harvest of our heart gardens is determined by the softness and quality of our soil and the thoughts and feelings that we allow to set up roots there. What is the quality of your heart soil? What are the sin seeds that are buried in your heart, ready to root down and grow tall? Or do you have a lush garden of weeds, of well-established sins that need to be systematically dug out one by one? It's backbreaking work, but think of all the good fruit and beautiful flowers you can grow in that heart soil once the weeds are gone. This is not something we can do on our own. This is a job for which we need the master gardener, the one who created the soil, who created the plants, and who knows how to get out the whole root without any traces left behind. Why would we trust the garden of our heart to anyone else?